All right.
Have a seat.
Sure. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for a short delay as we worked out some technology. Welcome to this event. My name is David Myers. I am not Bill Hamilton, who was supposed to be moderating this event. Bill is the president of what's called ISIG, or Storycrafters. It's the Institute for Storycraft and Information Gathering. I am on the board with him, so he's asked me to step in because his travel plans delayed him today. So I'm happy to be here. We're going to have a couple presentations, and then we'll get into a Q&A. So what I'd like to do first is introduce our three speakers, and then we'll get right into it. First up, to my right is Neil Swidey, class of 91. Neil's a professor. Neil's a local legend. Neil is professor of the practice and director of the journalism program at Brandeis University and editor-at-large of the Boston Globe magazine. Neil's work has appeared in the Best American Science Writing, the Best American Crime Writing, and the Best American Political Writing. His book, Trapped Under the Sea, was named one of the best books of the year by Amazon and Booklist. His first book, The Assist, was named one of the year's best by the Washington Post. He's also co-author of the New York Times bestseller Last Lion, The Fall and Rise of Ted Kennedy. With the help of friends, he founded the All Ray Scholars Program, a mentoring and scholarship nonprofit that helps give first-generation college students from Boston a second chance at a college degree. He and his wife, Denise Drower Swidey, J90, who is a TV food producer and Tufts instructor, have three daughters. And I first met Neil, which somewhere where he's not on his bio here, when he was at the Middlesex News, when I was a student here at Tufts. Next to Neil is Bill Sanderson, class of 81. Bill's journalism career... Reunion year. Bill's journalism career spanned more than 40 years and included stints at the Concord Monitor, in New Hampshire, my hometown paper, the Bergen Record in New Jersey, the New York Post, and the New York Daily News. His freelance work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, MarketWatch.com, and Politico's New York edition, as well as other publications. Additionally, Bill is the author of two books, Bulletins from Dallas, about White House reporter Merriman Smith and the media's coverage of John F. Kennedy's assassination, and Do For Me, about New York political scandal. He earned a BA degree from Tufts in '81 and lives in New York City. And then our third panelist, Julieta Grane, at the end of our row here. Julieta is graduating tomorrow. During her time here at Tufts, she has served as the Tufts Daily's executive opinions editor, managing editor, and editor-in-chief. She is a biology major and English minor, planning to attend law school in a few years. Outside of the newsroom, Julieta was a teaching assistant for the Tufts University Prison Initiative of Tufts College and co-taught an ex-college class focused on critically analyzing true crime media. So let's welcome all of our panelists. Like I said, we're going to engage them a few minutes to talk through some of their work and how it relates to our topic of misinformation. We'll start off with Neil.
Great. Thanks so much, David. Welcome back to campus, everyone. How many people have been in this classroom before? Oh, this morning. But I mean, as a student, this is a room I never dared to walk into. I think I would have been asked to leave. So it's nice to be welcomed back and not asked to leave, although the afternoon is young. Anyway, we're going to dive into some difficult matter here today, particularly on a Saturday afternoon, to try to figure out how you solve the unsolvable question of all the fake news, the misinformation, the disinformation that's out there now, and then colliding with AI and this explosion of AI. At Brandeis, we offered for the first time a course this semester in AI and journalism, and a young journalist colleague who was teaching that told me the difference from the beginning of the semester to the end of the semester, so 3.5 months, the landscape has completely changed just in that. So I don't know how much we're going to solve today, but we'll get into a few pieces of advice and some observations that we've been collectively trying to figure out in journalism and in journalism education right now. First off, a little clip.
תודה. מה שאלת אותי?
ראש הממשלה אומרים ברשת שאתה בכלל מת?
אני מת על קפה, אתה יודע מה? אני מת על העם שלי. איך הם מתנהגים, פנטסטי. אתה רוצה לספור את מספר אצבעות?
אתה יכול להראות לנו?
פה. פה. היית?
יפה מאוד.
לחיים.
ראש הממשלה מסר לאנשים שיוצאים ומתאווררים?
לצאת להתאוורר, אבל ליד.
Okay, real or fake? Fake? Why? You don't know me. Any thoughts? Yes.
Casual.
Too, okay. Other thoughts?
And all his fingers.
So that means it's
Real.
okay. So from the real camp. Yeah.
Look much younger than that.
He does look. I wondered if that was a fresh from a Botox treatment, right? Okay. This is actually real. This clip is real. And what's interesting and one of the things that's changed just over the last few months is AI has gotten much better. So you mentioned the 5 fingers, right? The first clip, so this clip flew around social media right after the bombs from Iran landed in Israel, and there was a clip of Netanyahu, and one of the hands looked like it might have 6 fingers, and people said that was AI, he's dead. And then he and his team went out to this coffee shop to say, I'm alive. And then that produced a whole new spasm of it's fake. But the things you think could help you determine what is fake and what's real are changing too fast. So you can't rely on those things anymore. Grok, which is X's AI detection tool, announced that this was AI. It was not. So they used this tool. Grok is the AI Elon Musk platform. That was completely wrong. And so this is where we are right now. AI video has become so believable that it makes footage that is real seem fake. And that's called the liar's dividend. You know, this is what you win when you can make everyone question whether something is true or fake. This is just the reality we live in now. So how do we deal with this? And so how many people here are journalists or have done journalism before? The rest of you all have to be journalists now. If you want to find out what the truth is, this is the world. You're going to be uncompensated journalists, which is not that different from real journalists. What we do in journalism is we go on the hunt for information. And this is what I like to think of this when I'm telling students about this, is you're trying to triangulate the truth. So you're taking multiple information streams and sources, and you're pulling it together, and you're trying to make your best analysis of whether something is real or not. And so how do you do that? First, you have to seek genuine source diversity. If all of your sources, or if your multiple sources all trace back to the same source itself, then it's a little bit of a house of cards. So you have to be mindful of that. When things come out that shock you, be suspicious if they're the only ones reporting that. There is a difference between an exclusive and something that is fake. So an exclusive, what generally happens if a news outlet, a reputable news outlet, reports something that's kind of stunning, then other sources, other reputable sources kind of pile on and report that the Wall Street Journal is reporting today that this happened, and we made efforts in the Washington Post or the New York Times or NPR to verify the central claims. There's a process that happens with that. So if you see something and doubt it and you quickly Google it to find other sources and there are no other sources, that's probably your tell, because there are exclusives out there, but the exclusives don't live in a vacuum for that long if something has happened. And just be aware right now that if something seems really novel, it's more likely to spread around that way. A few years before AI, a team of researchers at MIT tracked the explosion of fake news, and they found it spreads 6 times faster than the truth. So that's, that the old joke that a lie has traveled halfway around the world before the truth has its shoes on. This really is what happens on that. But look for those things. And if you do see multiple outlets, try to pay attention to differences in fact, tone, and focus. And just look for sources that show their work. So if someone, right now, it's sort of inexcusable for news outlets not to have links to primary sources that they're using it from. And a lot of that is about transparency now. So you can actually determine, okay, they're quoting some record, and then they post the record, and you can check that as well. This is still something, and coming from the Boston Globe for in a kind of newspaper focus, newspapers are still the best at admitting their mistakes every day. And so even digital outlets that are connected to legacy, it's a great correction, isn't it? Sounded like 30,000 pigs were floating down the river. But look for sources that actually admit when they make a mistake. Did you get the picture before I hit the slide? Yeah, got it. Okay. And then just sources that are transparent about authorship, ownership, funding, the difference between news and opinion. So what happens, a lot of fake news, don't bother to put bylines on there. So look for bylines, and if it's a byline, you can check that person and see what the other pieces that person has written before. If there's no byline, that's a kind of a tell. The Times has gotten much better at explaining basic things like what's the difference between op-ed and editorial, and so there's some piece of that. But if you go to the About page on any digital outlet and trace it back, again, you're being a journalist, you're working like a journalist, you can often find revealing news about whether this is a reputable source or not. The big thing I try to encourage my students is to be open and actually enthusiastic about being surprised and kind of go on these journeys to try to find things out. And there's real power in that, not to be misled, but be open to, I didn't know that, or this challenge is something I thought I knew, and to feel your mind moving and expanding a little bit. Fairness is a big issue when you're verifying sources. There's been a new trend with young students. I deal with this a lot, where people say anything they don't like is called both sidesism or false equivalence. And I try to teach them that that's not really what it is. But fairness is sort of going on this honest journey and figuring out what's happening. And then you render a verdict where the preponderance of the evidence. It's almost like making a case to a jury. In a long form, at least the journalism that I do, you go on that journey, you find things out, and then you admit along the way where there are the gaps in the story. When I've written about controversial things over the years, I've tried to be very deliberate at admitting what I don't know, what I couldn't figure out during this process. And I think sources that do that generally are more reputable. Fake sources don't admit the holes in their argument. Offer context and history of how we got here. I was just telling Juliet that I was a political science major here. I took more history courses than anything else, and they're actually more valuable to me as a journalist, because it's kind of how did we get here becomes part of that. I never filled out the paperwork to be a history major, but I did this. Pink slime, does anyone know what pink slime is? Have you heard about this? So it's a meat filler that the government allows you to put a bunch of fake stuff in the meat that you buy. There's a certain percentage that's allowable, but it's become an issue in media because there's a lot of fake slime out there. So how do you tell that? Look at this site here. Tell me anything interesting that you see on this homepage. No bylines, right. Buy North Boston News. Okay, so that's a good tell. What else? How many of you spent time in North Boston before? Doesn't exist, right? There's a South Boston, but not a North Boston. You see these things a lot, like if there's a name of a news outlet that they think, okay, it's like the Don't Stop Believing song, right? That has the part of Detroit, what is it?
South Detroit.
South Detroit that doesn't actually exist. So in a song, but not in a news outlet. They should have an actual identifiable tone. And then so you go to the About and you see a bunch of bullshit in here about like what they're doing. But part of it is that this is filling a need that's out there. We've lost 3,000 newspapers across the country in the last 2 decades. One of the great growth areas in independent, nonprofit digital startups that are filling some of that need. Probably some of your communities have one of these, often by retired journalists that have started these things up. But go to the About page and see what they say, who they are. Do they have these kinds of tells? And the biggest point I want to make to you is for all of us to seek out sources that challenge our own worldview. I think we're all guilty sometimes of wanting what I've started to think about as affirmation rather than information. We tend to do that. We tend to have a view about things. If you hate Donald Trump, you look for anything that kind of comports with your view about Donald Trump. If you love Donald Trump, it's the opposite of that. And really, that conflicts with responsible news gathering and news consumption, where you actually have to judge each thing on its merits. So if it goes down really easily and you think, this is perfect, I'm going to share this with all my friends, particularly the people who love Donald Trump, this is going to prove to them. Before you do that, actually start to think, is this a reputable source? Did it go on an honest journey? We do have this world, which started in the 80s and 90s with the erosion of the fairness doctrine and a lot of the erosion of equal time and all these other pieces that had been in place, where basically you have partisan media out there. And of course, most young people don't even know what cable TV is. My students don't even think about that. But social media has followed that same model of figuring out how to reward heat over light. That's where attention comes from. And heat gets you worked up and light makes you think. And social media is built for the former and not the latter. And we have to be better about that. So, and I just want to remind people may know her, she's a brilliant historian, Heather Cox Richardson, but, sorry, I'm going to offend some people on this here. I was at dinner a few weeks ago with a very bright older woman, and she told me that she had canceled her subscription to the New York Times. And I said, why? And she said, because they're not critical enough of Trump, which is like, okay, I haven't heard that from a lot of people, but okay. All right, give me some advice. I just want to kind of find out where she's at on there. And I say, where do you get your news from? And she said, Heather Cox Richardson. And I said, she's brilliant. As I told you, history is the thing I love the most. I love the connections that she makes. She is not a news source. She is not a news source. She is a news analysis, a source of news analysis and historical analysis. And we all have to question ourselves about that. She does not pretend to be someone out there finding new source. She's making connections based on the news that other people are reporting. And we have to, all of us, be comfortable with the idea that the people out there actually reporting the news are going to come up with some things that we find incompatible with our worldview, inconvenient with our arguments with family members, and we have to embrace that. And I think until we do that, we're going to lead ourselves more to these traps of fake news that fills our existing worldview. So there are some good sources out there. Grok is not one of them. This I would recommend. NewsGuard is a source out there. They have this reality check newsletter where they do something like the BB clip I showed you at the beginning each week, and they take something through. And so I recommend that because they also use a multifactorial view to doing things. They don't just trust AI to tell you what's AI and what's not AI, which is what Grok is doing. They find many ways of using technology and human critical judgment to actually make those decisions. And just lastly, AI has supercharged all of our problems in the world. So to be thinking about how we do these things, first, prize and support news outlets that do the things that AI can't do well, which is deeply reported investigations, accountability reporting, analysis, distinctive voice. AI bots are sycophants. They butter you up, but they can't coax a source to risk their job to give you documents that can blow open an investigation. Journalists actually do that. And the thing I've started to think this year, working with students, is that for a while now, we've been really good at telling them what not to use AI for and what, anyway, producing things and putting your name on it that you didn't produce. If as journalists, we don't take responsibility for the word choice and the word order and the sentence construction, then we have no business being journalists. So AI is not good for that, but I've really tried to focus on embracing what AI can do well. And there are many things AI can do well right now in terms of mostly on the reporting side. You can create algorithms to sift through millions of pages of documents to find patterns to then use as a reporter to go out and do that. So we've made a concerted effort to teach students good uses of it. It's like a balanced nutritional diet of good AI. But just finally, again, we're all journalists now, and you have to adopt, if you're having to be a journalist, you have to adopt that motto that the grizzled old hard drinking editor at the Globe first told me when I walked in there: if your mother says she loves you, check it out. So we have to do that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Neil. That was great. We will open up to questions in a few minutes after everybody else had a chance to go through what they wanted to share. So as soon as I can figure out how to get out of this, we're going to bring up Bill, and Bill's going to talk next. Sorry, I can't quite get it. There we go. All right. Please welcome Bill Sanderson.
Thank you. I spent a lot of my career working with text. I started pre-internet era, right, even before I got out of. I started pre-internet era before anybody had heard of any of the stuff that we're dealing with nowadays, and the stuff that came up at the end of my career. It just had no relationship to what happened when I started working for newspapers in the 1970s. But sometimes one of the ideas we were supposed to discuss today is, how do you tell something is fake? How do you tell something is not true? And over my years as a reporter and an editor, I'm not really sure how to answer that question. I know that there have been times in my life when I've looked at something that a reporter has filed to me or read something in a paper that I know isn't right. But other times it's a little harder. And I went looking through some of my own social media feed in the last few months to try to find some things to talk about today. And one of them is this story, which came up only the other day. And this was posted on on Facebook by a journalist I know. A journalist posted this. And this is about a Florida woman. So that's something right away. The Florida man, the Florida woman, that's got your interest right there. A Florida woman was detained Tuesday after police say she attempted to ride a shopping cart down Interstate 95 at nearly 3 a.m. using a shower curtain as a homemade sail. Now, I think a lot of us have read the Florida woman or the Florida man story enough times to say, gee, that sounds kind of normal, doesn't it? This is what you'd expect to happen in Jacksonville, Florida at 3 o'clock in the morning. And the story goes on. According to investigators, police reports, one witness told officers it looked like a homeless pirate entered NASCAR, and the thing went on. And then it talked about what the woman allegedly told the state troopers when she was arrested. This was posted by a journalist friend of mine in Florida. Not this person. The person who posted is not John Chapman, but this person just reposted what John Chapman wrote. And I looked at it this morning and I said, wait a minute, this just doesn't click for me. Something's wrong here. So I went looking on Snopes, which is a website that devotes itself to debunking things. And they had an item about this. And they said, this has been moving around the last 3 days and there's no evidence that's true. And then I looked a little further and I found some of the things Neil pointed out. Look for a legitimate source. There's no TV station, no newspaper, no nothing out there that's reporting about this. Look for a byline. There's no byline on it, although it's dressed up to look like a real news story, isn't it? It says Jacksonville, Florida as a dateline. And I think that these are things, God, I sure hope when I was working as an editor, they would have been things that I caught on to and stopped from being published. There's another one here that I liked, if I can get the slide up, and it's been around for some years. It has to do with, yes, it's this one. It has to do with the Obamas. And someone posted this, a friend of mine posted this on his Facebook a few months ago and said it was true, another former journalist, by the way. And this says that just 4 days after the November 12 election, Laura Bush called Michelle Obama and said, pack a bag, you and me, and bring the kids and bring the president. We're all going to go down to Texas and have a good time on the ranch. And what about this struck people as true? One of the things that struck people as true is I think people like to think that our presidents get along. They like to think that they're good guys who would help each other in a tough situation. We all know that the Bushes have, to say the least, a lot of antipathy towards the Obamas. Some of us have probably read that the Bushes and the Obamas get along pretty well. Barack Obama has said over the years that he came to have a lot of respect for President Bush because of the way President Bush handled his transition and because of the way, because of the way he comported himself towards the Obamas when the Obamas were switching over. And there are other Democrats who say the same thing about the Bushes. They say, I read Nancy Pelosi's recent memoir, and she said, he always was very straight up with me, very polite and very courteous, and I really respected that about the guy. So you want to believe this stuff. But the trouble is, it didn't happen. It's just simply not true. It gives you some clues. It says on the November 13th, this happened, and November 15th, this happened. On November 15th, the 4 adults stayed up until 3 a.m. All you have to do is look up the official White House schedule from those days to know that the Obamas were in Washington then, and that Barack Obama was getting ready on a trip to Greece. And if my memory is working right, on the 15th, he was either on Air Force One on his way to Greece or holding a press conference in Athens, Greece, with some Greek officials. But someone out there put this up, and it got circulated around on social media, and lots of people bought it, and lots of smart people put it out there. And I guess what strikes me, having spent 40 years writing and editing and dealing with this stuff, is some of the things Neil talked about have always gone on. I remember a weekly newspaper in a town where I worked that had one reporter, so they made up a bunch of fake bylines to make the stories look real, even though there's only one person writing for the thing. And frankly, at the New York Post, we used fake bylines on a couple of things from time to time. You can't.
Barron Trump?
No, it was. We would use a fake byline if we had a reporter who was in the newsroom on a tryout, and if you was someone from, say, the Daily News, you didn't want to say that. You didn't want to say that this. You wanted to have a byline on the story, but you didn't want to say that. Well, you didn't want to identify him as a Daily News reporter, so you'd say, I think we had you used the byline as Frank Ryan. So anytime anybody who saw Frank Ryan, you knew it was a tryout. At least those of us who knew what was going on. But those are things you can look for that tell you that it's fake. And you can also, I hate to say it, but we do have to be journalists now. We do have to read critically in a way that I don't think I had to read 40 years ago, and look out for things. And particularly, I think, look out for things that sort of try to grab you emotionally, like this Barack Obama idea that the Obamas and the Bushes are good friends. That's something you really want to believe. Just as much, almost as much as you really want to believe that a Florida woman would attach a shower curtain to a shopping cart and sail it down I-95 in the middle at 3 o'clock in the morning. So that's just what I have to say about this. I think journalists themselves are having a very hard time dealing with this stuff. And I also concur with what Neil said about how it just changes very quickly. I know that when I got to the end of my career, when I was working at the New York Daily News, we worried a lot about something called search engine optimization. And 2 years after I've left, I'm not even sure if people care about that anymore. But I do know that we cared a lot about putting links in stories to original sources if we could do it. I was always badgering reporters to do that because not only is that something that is good for readers, but we found out that the search engines like that. They would have put our stories up a little higher. We were always looking for things that would put the search engines up, that would move our stuff up in searches, and rewriting the tops of stories, what we call the leads of stories, the first paragraphs of stories with words that people tend to search on. In this case, you might just Laura Bush, Michelle Obama. Those are words that people might type into Google on a random basis. We're always trying to do things like that. And I think that just you have to be very mindful of the emotional pull that writers are trying to pull for right now, and of the need for you to be careful of your own emotions in evaluating whether something is true or something you want to double check on. That's the end of what I want to say about this topic.
Thank you, Bill. We'll come back for some questions in a few minutes. I'm going to bring up Julieta next. I'm really glad that she's here because it bookends some of my experiences here at Tufts and at the Daily. Every once in a while, Tufts makes national news, either school rankings or new discovery and by researchers. Often it's something very positive. Sometimes it's not always positive. So when I was editor of the Daily, there was a misinformation campaign that went on campus. Ended up, the New York Times called the Daily, and I was interviewed. I was interviewed by Good Morning America about the story because misinformation was being spread on campus. So it's happened again recently during Julietta's time at the Daily. I don't want to spoil the story, so I'm going to let her tell a story. I think it's a story you're familiar with, but you're not going to know the background of how it all started and how the Daily and Tufts was involved and the misinformation involved.
Yeah. Is this on? Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I don't have any slides or words of wisdom, but I'll talk about what the Tufts Daily has been working on and how we've kind of approached misinformation, not so much related to AI, but rather how we've been in national news in the last few years. So I was the executive opinion editor in fall of 2024, which is when October 7th happened. And before then, the opinion section was somewhat sleepy compared to the other sections. It wasn't, as robust as the news section. It wasn't as fast-paced as the features section. It was more when people had some sort of lukewarm take that they wanted to share, someone would publish something in the opinion section. But after October 7th, people had a lot of strong opinions, and the Daily became a really good place to field those opinions. If you go back and look through some of the articles that were published, there were dozens from alumni, from students, graduate students, undergraduate students. Lots of members of the Tufts community wanted to share their opinions and chose the opinion section as the place to do that, which meant that all of the undergraduate reporters and opinion editors who didn't have that much extensive reporting backgrounds were tasked with editing these articles that included a lot of facts, a lot of opinions presented as fact, and had to sort of sift through that information and figure out the most ethical way to publish this and make sure that everyone's opinions were heard without compromising the integrity of the paper. And that was a very difficult task. It involved a lot of research, a lot of investigation that wasn't typically done in the opinion section, but most of all, a lot of conversations. And kind of going back to something that was said before, it included a lot of challenging our own personal opinions. And instead of approaching it from each one of our personal perspectives, it was a lot of dialogue with each other. Thankfully, there were a lot of different opinions and perspectives represented in the Daily, that there still are. So we were constantly challenging each other and sort of trying to get to the truth before we were able to publish those opinions. And I was a sophomore, so I was, a little bit in over my head, but it was a really great introduction to what journalism and what reporting would be like. So then the following semester as managing editor, which is more of an editor position rather than just focused on the opinion section, it was more editing all of the different sections. And that's when I really started reporting for the features and the news sections, including covering the encampments happened that semester. And in that semester, Rumesa Osterk and a few other students sent in another opinion article, which probably some of you have read. And I was part of the group that made the decision not to allow them to have anonymity. And I thought and reflected a lot about this opinion now because obviously, or this decision now because it had such dire consequences. But I still stand by the fact that we knew that in order to preserve the integrity of our opinion section, people's names had to be behind their opinions. If you publish everything under anonymity, it becomes more of a bulletin board than a newspaper. And while we couldn't have foreseen, we didn't know that Marco Rubio was reading the Tufts Daily at the time, unfortunately, we thought long and hard about whether or not to grant anonymity because there were so many other people that we didn't grant anonymity to, because all of these opinions were so sensitive, because everyone was feeling very conflicted about whether or not to share their opinions. We decided that it was best not to selectively choose to grant anonymity in this one case. Then the following semester, I was editor-in-chief, and thankfully nothing happened. It was so boring, and that was great. But then unfortunately, the following semester was when Rumesa was abducted here in Somerville, which was devastating to our entire community, but particularly prompted some really challenging conversations within the Daily of reevaluating whether or not we should grant anonymity in these cases, now that we know that the Trump administration has a different approach, has different standards, has a very vindictive and personal way of approaching what we take for granted as freedom of speech and as journalists. we, had to reflect on how we were going to still have the trust of our community members to share their perspectives and still use our opinions section as a place to have constructive dialogue throughout our community. And at the same time, grant anonymity when it's appropriate and deciding when it's not appropriate. And so that was really difficult that semester, and it still is, and it continues to be a challenge, a push and pull of how to have their trust while still respecting our authorship and our readers, to not disappoint when and where we do grant anonymity. So that's still an ongoing conversation. And I think when we're talking about truth and misinformation in the media at the Tufts Daily, that also has to do with when and where we allow things to be anonymous. And that's been difficult. But ultimately, I think the Daily has been and will continue to be committed to ensuring the highest level of fact and of truth and preserving that, whether or not that's a popular decision. And sometimes it has very severe consequences. But everyone at the Daily, I think, is trying their very best. And the fact that we have such a large and committed group of people who are doing great work. I'm on my way out, thankfully, but they're all doing great work. And yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to go to the Q&A section. I've got a couple questions I want to start off with, and then we'll go to the audience. So, Julieta, tell us how the Daily responds to criticism from students or the administration when they say that, I don't know, if you get accusations of fake news, and as well as what do your peers do when they're trying to understand whether something is true or not?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's definitely been a lot of criticism for different reasons. I think like when I was, for example, my first semester, I wrote an opinion article about how people should wear masks because it was 2022. And I got like an insanely horrific hate email from someone just totally disagreed and was like, no, masks don't work. And I think each sort of author takes it differently, or each journalist kind of approaches things differently. But in general, I think as an organization, when writing is criticized as being fake, the most important thing is being able to go back to the source. And of course, while there's some level of investigation that goes on in the Daily, it's mostly campus related. And so the bulk of what we write can always be attributed back to one of the real grown-up journalists where we get our information from. And so being able to point back to that is the best way to combat, accusations when you do have reliable sources behind it.
Okay, thank you. For Neil and Bill, same question for both of you. So I've also spent my whole career in journalism, and one of the trends I saw in recent years was the rise of fact checkers. We've always had things like PolitiFact, but then the fact checker from the Washington Post came in, and USA Today had fact checking desks. I think AP did some too. A lot of nonprofits did it, but it seems like that's now moved on and we're past that. So am I seeing that right? And is there something that the media is doing on the fact checking side to combat misinformation besides just writing good stories?
So there's always been this divide in journalism, as you know, about fact checking based on generally the Sunday magazine at the Globe had a fact checker, the New York Times had a fact checker traditionally. And I love working with some writers resent working with fact checkers because you're trying to ruin my great sentence. But my feeling is like any little chinks in the armor that you can have weaken the whole enterprise. So you might as well get it right. And so daily journalism, even at the New York Times, at the highest level with the best compensated newsrooms or most robust newsrooms, they didn't have fact checking just because of the turnaround. You couldn't kind of have a fact checking takes a while. Then we moved to this piece with PolitiFact and other people figuring out that fact checkers could be more front and center in the process. And when big projects, you would bring fact checkers in. And so I thought that was a great opportunity to do that. And then we got into the point of Trump kind of like so many things broke that system because outlets like PolitiFact and the Washington Post used to have, the Pinocchio nose thing, and you could count all the lies and mistruths, and it didn't matter. And it was impervious to that thing. So you were using a tool to fight something when it didn't matter to half the country. Again, on either side on this, the left is not impervious to this idea of not wanting facts to get in the way of a good feeling. They're just not as strategic and as refusing to admit reality as the right generally has been on this. And so I think that's where we're at now. And then AI has come in now and it's, again, supercharged all these things.
Bill?
I never worked with fact checkers because my whole career was with daily
Mike.
newspapers. I never worked with fact checkers. My whole career was with daily newspapers. We just, if I was an editor, I was the fact checker. And you count on the reporters to get the stuff right. But I have watched that trend, as Neil said, and I'm not sure what the next step is. I think it has gotten passé because of the Trump administration and because of how it's just getting harder and harder and harder to keep up with the things that are said that aren't true or inaccurate. Maybe a better way of saying it.
All right. Yes, please.
Yes.
I would like to inject the concepts of courage and survival into this discussion. In a situation where people may find that they have an absolute ruler who is a narcissist and who cares not a whit for other people in any manner or form. And he begins to fulminate outrageously. But everyone in the audience understands that he could destroy any one of us in a flash. And therefore, it seems to me that courage should be a major topic in this discussion. The guts to stand up and be counted in spite of the fact that you might be destroyed by a narcissist titan in the process. Because survival is obviously a major issue in all of this and in all that we as human beings do. So I'm trying to raise courage and survival as integral topics. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody want to respond in any way?
Hard to argue with that.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I do think you have seen in the past year the price of cowardice with big institutions that have failed spectacularly to do this. And I think you have to reward the institutions and the people who didn't do that because the pressures are enormous. So you can pick all those law firms that caved, and then you pick Wilmer Hale or others that stood up and said no. Like you can find this across industries, ABC and NBC that wrote those checks for specious lawsuits rather than fighting. You give credit to the institutions and the people that have withstood this pressure. But it takes support from the public for that as well, too. The silence, it can be a lonely place. And I've had journalist friends who have been at the receiving end of some of this pressure on this. And you need the support there. Even like nationally, the fact that all those people, when Kimmel was pulled off the air, suspended their Hulu subscription is why ABC caved. And that was actually good. That was a breaking point for there. And I feel on Bezos and the Post and the key decisions on there, I ask people, how many people canceled their Post subscriptions? How many people canceled your Post subscriptions? Okay. How many people canceled their Amazon Prime? That's the question we all have to ask. The Post does not affect in a whit Bezos's bottom line. Amazon Prime does. And we have to withstand our own inconvenience for that. And I think a lot of this has to do with questions for ourselves, all of us.
Who else is quick? Here we go.
There is clearly a difference between fake news and bias. There's also a difference between fake news and imprecise news. And I think what has happened is when Trump excoriates reporters, especially female reporters, and calls their reporting fake news, what he really means to say is it's imprecise. He makes everything that is written by CNN or said by CNN as if it was completely wrong. It may be imprecise, but I think a lot of people now think, well, this news probably is fake as opposed to imprecise. And he's made people into cynics, which is what autocrats do. They make people not trust general news, but they should trust only what the autocrat says. But instead, if we could have a dialogue that talks about imprecision as opposed to fake news, it goes away from black and white into shades of gray, which is what we have with every newspaper. It's biased. New Republic is left, National Review is right. And if you pick up those organizations, those periodicals, you know what you're going to get. And bias is understandable. Fake news is, for me, a horrendous concept, and it makes people not believe what they hear or read in newspapers. And that's a bad trend.
I've thought a lot about that over the last few years. I think maybe because of my work with the tabloids. And what I think that the word fake news, when Trump brought it up, has a lot of resonance, not because of the politics of what he says, but I think it has meaning to people because what you read in the paper doesn't always reflect your own personal life. You know, you read a lot about crime. Well, maybe that affects you, but maybe it doesn't. But it's happening somewhere else. It isn't reflective in the sense that this is something that affects me every day. And it took me back to a book by a New Yorker writer named Janet Malcolm, who talked about how you would be a fool to talk to someone like her because she's going to take your words and she's going to interpret them in her own way. Any writer is going to interpret them in her own way, and she's going to write it in a way that inevitably, because we're all human and because we're all individual, doesn't line up with your own view of the world and with your own way of thinking about your own life. And so I think that's why when Trump says, call something fake news, I think that's one of the reasons it has a lot of resonance. And I don't know how to combat that. I don't know, you know, I felt that Malcolm's book fell short of what I call accountability news, which is where I spent a lot of my life as a reporter covering government meetings and covering court hearings and writing down what people said and did during them. But I kind of get that also that a lot of people don't feel in touch with what they see in the media for a lot of different reasons. And I don't think it's just political reasons. I think that's why that word resonates. I think you can, I would love to attack the guy on all kinds of other fronts. I mean, I don't like his treatment of women journalists. I don't like his treatment of journalists in general. But I also think that when he puts that term fake news out there, it was a brilliant choice because I think it speaks to a lot of people in a lot of ways that don't necessarily reflect partisan politics.
I'd like to address the question of we're all journalists now, or we should be journalists now. On the flip side of that, you have people who simply want to be spoon-fed the information. Part of the rise of Fox News had to do with, I could just keep it on 24/7 and be fed this sort of pablum or information. And because it's on cable news, I can believe it. But in fact, we can't. Fast forward to now, you're getting a lot of coverage of people, and I was in a panel thing this morning with Diane Hessen, who's done a lot of work on this subject. Trump voters who are suddenly, now that their grocery bills haven't gone down and their gas bills have gone up and whatnot, are saying, but I didn't know this was going to happen. And it's like, have you heard of Project 2025? Did you read any of this news? And they say, well, no, I didn't have time to do any of that. Now you're outlining something and you're probably preaching to the choir, saying we all need to triangulate and we need to go to original sources and PolitiFact. And I'm saying, in this era, do you actually think you can get receivers of the news to do that kind of work? Or I guess if you do, how do you think you can encourage people to question and look in more depth to the information that's being given out?
I think part of the problem is you've mentioned Fox News or MSNBC or even CNN, there's so little journalism that happens on those networks. There's so little reporting that actually happens. It's commentary. And so it makes it much more vulnerable to this idea that it's biased, because it is. I mean, those institutions are by definition biased because they figured out that that's what worked for ratings. And then they're not our problem anymore because of the age demographics. Those networks are going away eventually on there. But the problem is it's metastasized on the social media level, and people want it more easily. They want to feel that. So I think we can only control ourselves and what we do. And do we have higher standards for what our news consumption is? And then do we share that information? And do we feel an obligation to have vetted it before we share it? Bill and I, and everyone on this panel, has been trained in journalism that it's embarrassing if you share things that are wrong. It's a stain on your reputation. So you go to all these lengths to do that. What we're saying is we haven't found an alternative to all of us collectively doing that before we share that information. And I hope some young people like Julieta and her colleagues will figure out the way to do this. Maybe you can gamify fact checking like Wordle. You'll find ways to do that. I hope someone figures that out, because games have been a huge source of the Times revenue that's funding the newsroom. So let's figure that out.
We've got time for, okay, quickly.
I just want to add to that. Fox News is a marketing plan. Okay, it's not a news network. They know who they're after. They know that they're after a particular demographic, and so everything that they say is targeted to that. I'm kind of sorry to say that. They do have some journalists who do some reporting, but your Hannity's, your Tucker Carlson news there, it was all aimed at a very particular audience, and this is what they talked about in their planning. We need this audience. This is the group. We need the people who believe this stuff so we can sell them pillows or gold coins or whatever it is. What? Both those things. And I mean, I say this having worked for the Murdochs for a long time. That's how they're thinking.
We've got time for one or two of their very quick questions. Whoever you want.
Neil, I think you said that students today or young people don't use cable news. So where are they getting is it social media that they get their information?
I can talk about my students, but we've got a student here.
Yeah, hello. I would say social media, from Instagram, X. The Daily's Instagram account is definitely where we get the most engagement, with 10,000 followers on the Tufts Daily's Instagram, which is more than who picks up the physical paper or looks at the website. Yeah, social media for sure.
But part of it is we want guides to the news. So influencers have figured this out, and news institutions are trying to figure this out as well. And again, that goes back to that question. Yes, I'll take a guide for travel. I'll take a guide for restaurants, even though, as my wife is a TV food producer, and this idea that influencers go in and demand free stuff when the good restaurant critics used to hide their identity, to me is an abomination. But whatever, that's not earth-shattering. The rise or fall of the empire is not going to happen on free food for influencers at restaurants. But it does speak to this idea that people want this. So we've got to figure out how to adapt good journalistic practices to the way people want to consume their information now.
Last questions in the back. Oh,
Which some accounts are doing. There are some, like the New York Times and unfortunately the Washington Post, are doing TikTok very well, and they adapt their same articles that do adhere to really good journalistic practices into a short form that is very effective. I suggest if any of you want to take a look, the TikTok accounts of some newspapers.
All right, last question.
Thank you. This may open up the subject to another whole session, but I really appreciate the advising about defense, how we all can watch out. And I just want to put it to you journalists, where do you see the offense? In other words, who's going after the disinformers, the misinformers, the sources, and the forces that are making this mess of our information universe? It doesn't happen. It does happen just if nobody does anything. I know that, but we're in a much worse place. That it's not just happening by chance. So where's the journalism that you see, or where would you like to see it, that's going to call out who were the sources, name, blame, shame them? Thank you.
I don't have an answer to that question. I mean, I just don't know. I think it really does rest with us as consumers. I know that legitimate I know that the newspapers I worked at, I mean, including for the Murdoch papers, cared a lot about being accurate, cared a lot about getting correct information out in their news stories. But I also know that rather than one of the things they prioritized, both the tabloids I worked at in New York City, was lawyers. A lot of our copy was read by lawyers before it went into the newspaper, even if it was something innocuous. Towards the end of my time, even sometimes a government meeting would send it to the lawyers and say, is this okay? Are we going to get sued over this? But as far as the people who just make stuff up, they live anonymously. These two things that I put up here, I don't know where they came from. I tried to trace it back as far as I could. I really can't give you any names or places or who's behind any of it.
I'll say I work in nonprofit media now, and so much of the focus is just growing resources to serve communities. They're not focused on that kind of thing. They want to provide news that serves the people who live in, well, not North Boston, but maybe South Boston or someplace like that, where these news deserts have arisen, and all the money they can raise through advertising from foundations, whatever it might be, is trying to get reporters who can come in and cover the communities.
Yeah, community journalism has taken a huge hit, but it's where the source of what I find inspiration. I have my students now going, we partner with new startups, and they're learning, they're going out and covering things in communities. And communities are the last place where partisanship hasn't taken over everything. We used to have a point where people used to split the ticket nationally. You'd vote for your congressman who got you the bridge money, and then you'd vote for the Republican president. And then that stopped. Newt Gingrich, when I was here, not long after I graduated, that whole approach, make every congressional race a national race rather than a local race, that has changed our politics. But the local places are still where you have a shot at getting, whether you're getting the pond cleaned up in your town. And if you've got good journalists who are doing that's happening there. And I will say, on the national level, the institutions are still working. Murdoch has done a lot of harm for this world, unforgivable harm. But the Wall Street Journal is doing great reporting. And in some ways, it's more important than some of the Times reporting, because people don't automatically reject it. They see the Wall Street Journal, and they've done some great accountability reporting on this administration. And so it is happening at various places while they're being sued. The Times has been sued. The Wall Street Journal has been sued by this administration using this playbook, which, as some people have mentioned, is the authoritarian playbook. You go after the media first. It's not original, even if it's just been done really well, really effectively. But there is promise that's happening both at the local and at the national level, and we just have to support it.
Julieta, Bill, Neil, thank you all very much for coming today. Thanks, other panelists. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate you being here. Thank you for allowing me to fill in as the moderator. Enjoy the rest of your reunion weekend. And if you're here tomorrow morning, come see Julieta graduate.